Good evening. I'm Lori Humphreys, member of the Westminster Residents Present Committee. Since September, Ken Ashworth has hosted many of the Monday evening programs, but tonight he is turning the tables. Ken, author and former Texas Commissioner of Higher Education, will be our presenter. We are filming in the chapel, 6 feet from one another, and will only remove our mask when speaking. The program is somewhat different from the previous ones. It is similar to the interview format. Instead of a panel, I will ask Ken questions at the end of the presentation. Tonight, Ken will reintroduce or perhaps introduce Westminster audiences to the poet Edna St. Millay, the trumpet of her time. As you will learn, she was more than a poet. She was opera librettist, playwright, short story writer, political advocate, and radio celebrity. Ken uses the euphemism indecorous to describe her personal life. Some might argue she was a libertine. One thing is for sure, her love life produced some of her greatest sonnets. As our grandchildren might say, whatever. Her poetry is all that matters. And what a life she led. She did it her way before the song was sung. Take it away, Ken.
Thanks, Lori, for that introduction. I call Edna St. Millay the trumpet of her time for all the issues that she spoke about and defended as an American poet. She was very important, and it's regrettable that she is being forgotten. In her time, the British novelist and poet Thomas Hardy said America had made two great contributions. One of them was skyscrapers, the other was Edna St. Millay. Most everyone is familiar with her saucy quatrain that became the mantra of her era. My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. After her death, Edna's papers and belongings were controlled by her sister, Norma, who preserved everything but 3 items that she felt she had to burn. One was a letter she considered too indiscreet, written in Edna's youth, to a male homosexual she was trying to seduce. Norma also burned a group of nude photos she found of Edna. And she burned an ivory dildo, although burning that took a good while. Vincent, or Edna, as she called herself, was a wisp of a girl, barely over 5 feet, and weighing a scant 95 pounds. Her fire red hair hung to her waist until later she fashionably cropped it. She had the Irish complexion, her immaculate skin pale as milk. Yet 100 years ago, that little woman became a principal mouthpiece for social change and women's sexual liberation in America. Her books sold in the tens of thousands. In 1923, she became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. She was 31. She marched and wrote as a suffragette. She demonstrated to protest the execution of Psycho and Vanzetti. During World War I, she went to court with the editors and publishers of the journal The Masses when they were charged with treason. Perhaps one of the reasons that she stood up in that case was that she was sleeping with one of the editors. She spoke against the new Sedition Act enforced during World War I that imposed a 20-year sentence to, quote, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government of the United States. But when needed, she strongly advocated a forceful government. She stood vigorously against Charles and Anne Lindbergh when they preached that the American public should not resist fascism and the Nazi conquest of Europe. Her poetry was an instrument of action. When the Nazis in the little town of Lidice, Czechoslovakia, shot all the men and boys and enslaved the women and dynamited and plowed under the village in retribution for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the author of The Final Solution, she read it at a time, she wrote a radio script at that time condemning the massacre. She read it at a time when Americans still believed we should stay out of the European war. And late in 1941, when we had an army smaller than Romania, the extension of the draft passed the House of Representatives by one vote. One vote. She was out front arguing we had to confront the fascism to save the world from the dark ages falling over Europe. Millay's poetry was an early voice for women's liberation. It is so easily decoded. She spoke of sexuality, equality, nature, and experience, and she did it with humor and wit. Her poetry was clear and daring, even shocking. But the poem that first brought her wide acclaim she called Renaissance, a 20-stanza poem in rhymed couplets. She was just 19 when she learned that a publisher was soliciting poems from which 100 would be published as a book, and the authors of the best 3 would receive $1,000 each, a lot of money in those days. The first readers of her poem assumed it came from a man, naturally. The notice she received that her poem had been accepted as one of the 100 in the book read, "Dear Sir." She replied, "I'm just an aspiring miss of 20. The readers at the journal were astonished that a poem of such depth and meaning could have been written by a young woman, a woman who appeared to be a mere slip of a girl. Self-educated to a large extent, Edna had not been in school for several years, yet she was a genius driven to make her mark. Though she came from a poor family and with a struggling mother and 2 younger sisters, living in a shanty on the coast of Maine, she had been working diligently on her poetry. While she waited for the judges to decide which of the 3 of the 100 poems would receive $1,000 awards, she and a sister were asked to attend and perform at a local party. At the end of their piano and singing performance, Vincent, as Edna called herself then, recited her poem, Renaissance. Carolyn B. Dow, a wealthy area patron, was in the audience. She was simply knocked over by this twig of a girl, her poem, her confidence, her delivery. Result? Carolyn Dow offered to pay for Vincent's college education. Although Edna had been encouraged to believe she might win first prize for her poem, in the end she was sorely disappointed and did not receive any of the 3 prizes. But a major literary critic singled out her poetry from the 100 for special commendation. 2 male participants in the competition wrote to Edna to say she should have received all 3 prizes. They deemed her poem the best of the lot. Upon seeing a copy of her poem, the officials at Smith College and Barnard offered her a full scholarship. Edna chose Vassar. At Vassar, she was taken as a lover by a lesbian, followed by a number of liaisons with other girls. She gained considerable notoriety and was popular. She participated in musicals, both performing and writing for them. Vassar's president, a man of course, even at Vassar, named Henry Noble McCracken, wrote to Edna, "You couldn't break any rule that would make me vote for your expulsion. I do not want a banished Shelley on my doorstep." Edna wrote back, "Well, on those terms, I think I can continue to live in this hellhole." Within a year of graduating, she was performing in plays in New York City. And within another year, she was writing plays herself. Still in her 20s, she wrote the libretto for a successful opera. Importantly, she continued writing and publishing poetry. In her poem, The Penitent, she describes how she is supposed to be sorrowful about her sins and weep and suffer and become pious, but she finds she simply cannot do it. It's all too gloomy, and she can't keep her mind on it. She ends that poem this way. So up I got in anger and took a book I had and put a ribbon in my hair to please a passing lad. And one thing's there's no getting by. I've been a wicked girl, said I. And if I can't be sorry, why, I might as well be glad. People were reading her poetry all over the country. Women's magazines loved her stuff. She could rightfully be called an early women's libber. But remember, this was while Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson were presidents. Women still could not vote. She resented oppression and the subservient roles assigned to women. Take this sonnet. Oh, you will be sorry for that word. Give me back my book and take my kiss instead. Was it my enemy or my friend I heard? What a big book for such a little head. Come, I will show you now my newest hat, and you may watch me purse my mouth and prink. Oh, I shall love you still and all that. I never again will tell you what I think. I shall be sweet and crafty, soft and sly. You will not catch me reading anymore. I shall be called a wife to pattern by. And someday when you knock and push the door, some sane day, not too bright and not too stormy, I shall be gone, and you may whistle for me. Now, Lori, doesn't that knock your socks off?
It does, it does.
Not too stormy, you may whistle for me. I'm sure Cole Porter learned a thing or two from Edna. One of the strengths of her poetry is its accessibility, its clarity. To know what she is talking about, you don't have to do a lot of guessing or speculating or decoding. Here's what she said about her writing. People like my poetry because it is mostly about things that anybody has experienced. Most of it is fairly simple for a person to understand. If you write about people who are in love and about death and nature and the sea, thousands understand. My poetry is about emotions, about experiences, common to everybody. Then too, my images are homey, right out of the earth. I never went to a big city, until I was 20 years old. So I have an age-old simplicity in the figures I employ. I use the same figures that my great-grandmother might have used. And you can just sit in your farmhouse or your home anywhere and read it and know you have felt the same thing yourself. Well, I'm not sure some of those farmers and their wives sitting at home in Kansas or Iowa knew exactly everything that Edna was talking about, but they got the drift. Her muses were love lost, love given, love broken off, and competing love. She was not just looking for words to give her lines nice sounds or onomatopoeia or sonority or alliteration. Every word had a precise use and purpose for her. There were no fillers. She was not obscuring something she should be ashamed about or to cover up her sins. E.E. Cummings epitomized for Edna the difficult poet. In evaluating his application for a grant that she was participating in, she wrote, "Here is a big talent in the hands of an arrogant, peevish, self-satisfied, and self-indulgent writer. Mr. Cummings may do anything he likes with the alphabet, the English grammar, and the multiplication table, provided only the result of his activities be something interesting. and after a reasonable period of application, comprehensible to a reader of culture and brains. Mr. Cummings may not, however, I say, write poetry in English, which is more difficult for me to translate than poetry written in Latin. He has written some of the most pompous nonsense I ever let slip to the floor with a wide yawn. I just love that. The most pompous nonsense I ever let slip to the floor with a wide yawn. That has just got to be one of the greatest put-downs in the history of literature. Millay's poems may have given her release, and perhaps they were at times therapy, but that's not what motivated her writing. Certainly the breadth of her experience and the frenetic pace gave her many new and ready subjects. What made her unique was that she had the fluency and command of her craft to get her true feelings down on paper. Upon the death of a young fellow graduate from Vassar, she ended her elegy with these lines: "Your singing days are done, but the music of your talk never shall the chemistry of the secret earth restore. All your lovely words are spoken, once the ivory box is broken, beats the golden bird no more." Often it was her hurting at a new loss that inspired her to write. After she was abandoned by a married man that she loved very deeply, who returned to his wife, she was devastated. Out of this, she wrote her first great sonnet. "Pity me not, because the light of day at close of day no longer walks the sky. Pity me not for beauty passed away from field and thicket as the year goes by. Pity me not the waning of the moon, nor that the ebbing tide goes out to sea, nor that a man's desire is hushed so soon, and you no longer look with love on me. This have I known always. Love is no more than the wide blossom which the wind assails, than the great tide that treads the shifting shore, strewing fresh wreckage gathered in the gales. Pity me that the heart is slow to learn what the swift mind beholds at every turn." On another occasion, she and a married man, a poet in his own right, found they had suddenly fallen deeply in love. But the very next day, without warning, he got shipped off to France and the war there before they could fully share their newfound love. He destroyed her passionate letters to him for fear that if he were killed, his wife would find her letters among his belongings. However, she wrote great poems to him in her mid-20s, all displaying her command of her instrument, and she served as the muse for the poems he wrote about her. She had multiple lovers, frequently in sequence and often simultaneously. Edmond Wilson, who would become a world-famous literary critic, lost his virginity to Edna. He said afterwards she looked at him thoughtfully and after a moment said, "I know how you feel. It was here and it was beautiful, and now it is gone." Edmond Wilson, being the nearly pathologically self-esteemed Edmond Wilson, could not believe Edna had not instantly fallen totally in love with him after he had bestowed his virginal lovemaking upon her, nor that she did not drop all other lovers and devote herself exclusively to him. But even when he finally recognized it was futile to hope that she would exclude all others to love him only, they continued their intimacies. He described years later in one of his memoirs how he and a friend had gone to her apartment and after dinner, quote, "Sitting on her daybed, John and I held Edna in our arms, according to an arrangement insisted upon herself. I her lower half and John her upper, with a polite exchange of pleasantries as to which had the better share. Once upon finishing a passionate lovemaking, she insisted on getting dressed and leaving quickly. Her miffed lover asked why she had to go so soon. She explained she had another encounter arranged nearby, and she was running late. I don't itemize these salacious aspects of her life merely to be titillating. Her intense need for sex was clearly excessive. Knowing a bit about her risque life is essential to understand her poetry and how she came to write some of it. Remember, my candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But my foes and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. Of course, she had to get rid of demanding or troublesome or tiresome lovers from time to time. A number of her poems deal with this continuing problem. She starts one describing how they share a cigarette at the end of lovemaking, and she ends it with these lines. Yours is a face which I can forget, the color and the features, every one, the words not ever, and the smiles not yet. But in your day, in this moment in the sun, upon a hill, the sun has set. Then Eugen Boissevin, a wealthy, elegant Dutch businessman and widower, pursued Edna and convinced her to marry him, knowing full well of the several boyfriends that she continued to see regularly during their courtship. At their small, intimate wedding, one of her lovers attended, accompanied by his wife, and from the beginning of their marriage, Eugen, as well as Edna, carried on his own love affairs. They stayed married many years until his death. At one point, Eugen had to go to Paris to fetch her home after she had been living for 5 months there with a much younger boyfriend who was becoming troublesome and abusive. Edna St. Vincent Millay was a true professional. Edmond Wilson observed that her one true obsession, her first love in life, was her poetry, above all else and above every one. And she worked at her profession diligently and unrelentingly to her dying day. But I would not want to mislead you to think that she wrote only of love and love-making and love disappointed. Much of her poetry dealt with contemporary events, such as the war in Spain, propaganda, and democracy versus fascism. As events were leading up to the larger war in Europe in the late 30s, she became controversial. She had come to the conclusion that the country needed to arm itself, and she caught hell from the American firsters. She was urged to go back to writing about love and stop writing and speaking about things a woman could know nothing about, especially a woman poet. In an appreciation of her American freedom of speech, she wrote of the place of the poet in society. Here's how Edna put it. Everything that touches the individual as an individual is matter for poetry. But when the poet becomes a member of the mass, his vein is soon to be exhausted. The poet can be concerned with what goes on outside, but the moment the outside comes in, dictates to him what pen, what ink, what paper he shall use, and what thoughts he shall think, he declines and dies. I think there must be a great communist poet, a great fascist poet. Communism and fascism are subjects for poetry, but communism and fascism will never permit these poems to be written. A few Russians could endorse that. She goes on to say, I can't imagine myself living, working in such a world. I should either have to stultify myself or be shot. She ended, the liberty under which this new book of mine comes out is more precious to me than anything anywhere. That's what makes life real. She truly believed in democracy. Edna had acted professionally on Broadway and was an impeccable performer during her readings. They were called readings, but she usually recited entirely from memory. No one had done readings like her across America since Charles Dickens had toured the country. Picture her with her fiery red hair and a black cape draped around her shoulders. She would appear in a red velvet gown molded to her body and trailing along the floor as she approached the podium or stood alone in the middle of the stage. She refused to use a microphone, even in large spaces, and she would wait for total, absolute silence before she began. As Nancy Milford, her biographer, said, it was her voice that captured people. That rich, dark, deep contralto always came as a surprise from such a little person. It was the honey, easy depth, the emotional vibrance of her voice that held her audiences to her. What was she doing when she tossed her hair back from her face, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, planted her feet wide apart squarely on the floor, and began? Edna St. Vincent Millay used her unbound vigor and determination to become a world-famous poet. She lived her life as she chose. She did indeed burn her candle at both ends, and it did not last the night. She died at 58, but still to this very moment and far into the future, she gives a lovely light.
That was wonderful, Ken. Thank you so much. I have a couple questions for you. You are the author of a memoir, Phantom in the Family, and The Horns of a Dilemma, a description of events at the University of Texas from 1969 and 1973, and one of the more recent books I've read of yours, which is absolutely marvelous, Caught Between the Dog and the Fire Plug, How to Survive Public Service. All three, however, very prosaic. Of all the poets you might choose, why Edna St. Vincent Millay?
Thanks, Lori. That's an interesting question. I suppose it came from my mother. She was abandoned with a number of children at 26. She'd been deeply in love. And I think Edna St. Vincent Millay's poems had special meaning to her. Love Lost and Love Found. I think it was from my mother that I got that interest in Edna St. Vincent Millay's poems.
Well, your mother must have been quite a remarkable woman, actually. A real person who lived her life in a very independent way. Do you have a favorite poem of Edna's that you would share with us?
Interesting request, Lori. There are many of her poems I love, but the one starts, I shall forget you presently, my dear. So make the most of this, your little day, your little month, your little half a year, ere I forget or die or move away. And then she goes on from there.
Well, that sort of captures her in a nutshell. Before she married, her writing supported her mother and sisters. What role did Nancy Boyd play in her life?
Well, Lori, I know you've been doing a lot of reading to get ready for this and helping me with trying to clean up some of the presentation. So why don't I turn that question back on you? You probably know more about Nancy Boyd than I do, so I'm going to let you answer your own question on that.
Talk about turning the tables, Ken. Well, Nancy Boyd was actually her pseudonym, and she used it for her prose writing, which was quite considerable. She wrote for the Ainsley, which was a publication that had a short life, and Vanity Fair, among others. She has one book titled 3 Victorian Women Who Changed the World. And there is a collection of Nancy Boyd's writings, prose writing, called Distressing Dialogues. And I learned all this on Google. So if you're interested in any of those books, you can find them there for him. She may be a new voice for many people, but her poem, Memory of Cape Cod, was read at Jackie Kennedy's funeral. I was introduced to her late in the late 1950s by a college friend who frequently would quote, "My candle burns at both ends." Did she influence any future poets?
Yes, she did, of course, influence other poets. The modernists pretty much rejected her. Her poems actually rhymed, and that was difficult with many of the modernists had with her. But Dorothy Parker comes to mind very quickly as someone who really she influenced, partly not only because of her poetry, but her wit. Dorothy Parker once said, "I'd rather flunk my Wasserman test than read a poem by Edgar Guest," another poet. You have to know that the Wasserman test was a test for syphilis to understand the wit of that. Then also, Dorothy Parker was present at a Halloween party one night, and as she opened the door, the hostess welcomed her in, and Dorothy Parker saw these people on their knees around a tub of water, and she says, "What are those people doing?" And the hostess said, "They're ducking for apples." And Dorothy Parker immediately said, "There, but for a typographical error goes the story of my life."
It's been such a treat to share this evening with you and Edna. I'm so glad to be reintroduced to her. She was wonderful. I am in awe of her independence and wonder what combination of genes and life create a person as unique as she. You know, she was something of a wit, as you mentioned. Here's an example. I loved this one. "It's not true that life is one damn thing after another. It's one damn thing over and over." If the audience wants to learn more about her, are there any biographies you would recommend?
We sort of planned this, Lori, because you've been reading one of these. The biography called "What Lips My Lips Have Kissed" by Daniel Mark Epstein, and another one by Nancy Milford, whom I quoted, "Savage Beauty," both wonderful biographies of Edna. And you can actually hear her recite some of her poems on YouTube.
Wow. Well, thank you, Ken. This has been wonderful. Edna should have the last word, though, I think. She was writing a poem for the Saturday Evening Post when she died. These lines haunt and soothe and speak to us as if she were here. From the apprehensive present, from a future packed with unknown dangers, monstrous, terrible, and new, let us turn for comfort to the simple fact: we have been in trouble before, and we came through.